Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, councillors, officers, and anyone watching at home on the internet or members watching online to this meeting of the Audit Standards and Risk Committee. Item on the agenda number 1, apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. So I've received apologies from Councillor Rakes, Councillor Wilson, and Councillor Tedder has let us know she'll either be late or unfortunately not be able to attend. Councillor Whitcroft and Councillor Noble are subbing for Councillor Rakes and Councillor Wilson respectively.
Thank you. Item 2, minutes of the previous meeting. These have been circulated. Does anyone have any comments about the minutes of the previous meeting? No? Can I sign these? Yes.
The answer is yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Item 3, declarations of interest. Does any member have a pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest in any of the items due for discussion this evening? That wasn't a fire alarm. I think the proper response is he's not going to sell any ice creams going like that. Morecambe and Wise. Yeah. No declarations of interest. Item 4, public question time. I believe there have been no public questions.
That's correct.
Okay. Excellent. Item 5, audit charter plan. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. So I'm bringing to committee an updated internal audit charter. Essentially, the charter defines the purpose, authority and responsibility of internal audit, the standards that we comply to, so whether those are CIPFA standards or the IA standards, require internal audit functions to have a terms of reference, which initially are discussed by the senior management team and then go to members for agreement. So these terms of reference we refer to either as the audit mandate or the audit charter. So members may recall, most members may recall, the charter last came to committee November 2023, so about 2 years. So I think the general expectation would be for the audit charter to be reviewed every 2 years and to bring it back to members for discussion and agreement. I thought, Chair, if I just highlight the key changes in the document rather than going through all the document in detail. So essentially, for this review, there were 5 key changes. The first one was to reinforce the purpose of the audit charter and the mission of internal audit within the council. The second major change was to clarify the mandate for the internal audit activity in terms of why we're here, the existence of internal audit and what the added benefit of internal audit function is within the council. There have been some key changes to the public sector internal audit standards, which tend to be the set of standards that the internal audit team here at Surrey Heath have adopted. Those have now been revised in the last 12 or so months, and they're now referred to as the global internal audit standards. They're now active with the private sector, as I understand, but they don't go live with the public sector until April, but to all intents and purposes, most local authorities and public sectors have begun to adopt those standards. So I've made some changes within the audit charter to reflect those. Another key change was clarifying the role of the audit committee and the terms of reference. Obviously, when the audit charter was last presented to members, it was just members of the audit committee. Now we've obviously got the risk on top of that, and terms of reference, as I understand it, have been amended to reflect that. So the audit charter needs to recognise that the terms of reference of the audit committee have been revised. The other key change was strengthening the arrangements for reporting in the Charter. So obviously, internal audit identify a number of key controls and key findings throughout our work programme during the year. And I've made the working arrangements for reporting those arrangements either through senior management team, through external audit, through the audit committee. I've made those reporting arrangements more robust in the audit charter to clarify what our roles within the audit team are for reporting findings. So I'm happy to take questions after that, Chair. Those are the key changes that I wanted to bring to the audit committee, and I think the recommendation is that members are being asked to review and agree it. But I'm happy to take questions from that presentation.
Thank you, Alex. And you've summarised these in 1.5, yeah?
That's right, Chair, yeah.
Yeah. Members, any questions for Alex on these changes? Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. In some places it refers to the Audit Committee, in other places it refers to the Audit Standards and Risk Committee. I'm assuming we interchange those two descriptions as the Audit Standards and Risk Committee would be my first question.
You're quite right, Councillor. I think obviously formally it's the Audit Standards and Risk Committee for the ease of reporting up at the Audit Committee, but to a large extent the Audit Committee for us is obviously the Audit Standards and Risks more formally, yes.
And next question, it references you having full access, obviously, to the senior management team. Have you ever faced any barriers to accessing the senior management team or anyone else within the organisation when you're carrying out your internal audit function and your team's internal audit function?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any examples internally where I've had resistance or barriers to obtaining information or contacting the senior management team or other members of the council. Capacity is obviously slightly different to barriers and constraints. So obviously trying to find the appropriate time or when a member of staff has actually got the capacity to help us, that's a slightly different issue. But in terms of actually resisting or stopping us do our job or actually speaking to them, I can't recall that happening since I've been here.
That's wonderful. In terms of capacity, I think that comes in a further report, doesn't it? So I'll park my questions on that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions for Alex? No? So we're asked to note this and agree it. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, Alex. Internal Audit Plan 25-26.
I'm on the wrong report, Chair. I do apologise. Okay, yes, I'm bringing the forecasted internal audit plan to committee. So obviously every March we bring the audit plan to committee. So essentially the audit plan is an expectation of our work programme to cover the next 12 months. Now, a few things to bear in mind with the audit plan. It is very much risk-based, so we undertake a risk assessment of the majority of areas or functions within the council, which we classify for simplicity as the audit universe. So essentially the audit universe covers all the functions that the local authority is expected to deliver on behalf of the residents. In terms of our resourcing, we obviously every year wouldn't be able to carry out effective internal audits for all those function areas, so we forecast and we carry out a risk assessment of a number of those. Now, a large number of the audits are carried out annually. For example, the core audits. So the core audits could include treasury, debtors, creditors, housing benefits, payroll. So most of those audits are actually relied on or could be relied on by the external audit team. So in terms of reliance on our testing. In the past, external audit have actually placed reliance on some of our findings from the testing, but that obviously varies from external audit to external audit. So at the moment, KPMG, Grant Thornton, haven't specifically placed reliance on our work, but they have asked to see all our audit reports. and make sure that all the audit recommendations that we're raising are actually being tracked and followed up, essentially, but we'll come on to that in the next report. The audit plan forecasts a number of expected or budgeted days for each of those audits. So we have to give an indication as to how long we expect that piece of work to take. So for procurement, for example, it could be 10 or 12 days, so we forecast that. So those days aren't necessarily set in stone. They're an indicative number of days that we feel that that piece of work will need us to deliver in terms of person days. So the audit could come in well under budget, or it could be that if we find any particular major or material issue, that could mean that the audit could take an extra 1 or 2 days. But there is some sort of flexibility within the plan to enable us to adapt to changes. Some other areas to consider: we've got contingency within the plan. So especially last year, for example, the senior management team may approach us to do additional or consultancy work. So we have to build in an element of that. That could be special investigations. We did an investigation of a resident of the borough last year. We assisted the previous MO undertake 1 or 2 investigations into parish councillors, and obviously we've factored that into the annual plan to enable us to assist the organisation to deliver that. I've identified a number of person days required to deliver the plan. So the person days will obviously include dedicated days to deliver those particular jobs, as well as training and development, annual leave obviously, and as I said, an element for contingency and attending meetings and preparing management reports. I've also identified within the annual plan the frequency with which those audits have been carried out. So you can see most of the audits at the top of the plan have been carried out annually, but as you go down, some of the audits are more periodical. For example, last year, I think the procurement audit was every 2 years. After discussing with the senior management team, we've made that a higher priority for the council, and we're now carrying out that audit on an annual basis due to the amount of expenditure that the council could incur with contracts and procurement generally. So that's an example where we have made those changes. Some members of the senior management team have actually come back and challenged the number of days on some of the audits. So what you see now is some revisions that have actually undergone. So I think the grounds maintenance piece of work has actually been reduced slightly in terms of the number of days, because the head of service didn't feel that those number of days was particularly justified. Climate change, we've reduced that, we've downscoped that slightly, and yeah, those are the main ones for that. But I think that's it in a nutshell, Chair. I'm happy to take questions on whether members feel the areas we're covering are covering all the areas members were expected, or whether they feel the budgeted number of days is a fair reflection on the jobs or not.
Thank you. I'll ask the same question I ask every time. Are you sure you've got enough resources for this?
I'm not sure, Chair. I would always like more resources, but the annual plan is actually reflective of what resources we've got. So it's written based on how many person days we've got to deliver the work programme. And it is quite a challenging work programme, to be fair. There are quite a number of areas. As you can see, we've not covered 6 or 7 or 10 audits. There is quite a broad scope, because we need to make sure we cover as many different areas as possible within the resource allocation. So, of course, everyone would like more resourcing, but given the current financial constraints of the council, the annual plan's been drafted based on 2 persons to deliver that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Noble.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Middleton, I noticed that corporate enforcement hasn't been reviewed for a number of years, but theatre, for example, is reviewed almost annually, as is parking. And I just wondered, what's the rationale for not reviewing corporate enforcement in recent years, but reviewing, say, the theatre on such a regular basis?
Thank you, Councillor. I think some elements of corporate enforcement are probably incorporated within other audits. For example, parking, for example, we do cover enforcement of parking within the parking audit. So rather than looking at enforcement of parking through making sure that we've got robust policies and procedures in place for dealing with parking offences. We actually cover that piece of work within the parking audit rather than corporate enforcement. Fly tipping, for example, might be covered elsewhere in planning, so we might cover that in planning. So I take on board your comments, that they're perfectly reasonable, and it might well be something that if yourself and other members are very keen on, we could consider including a more detailed piece of work on corporate enforcement later in the year, obviously at the expense of another audit, but that obviously we'd need to have that separate discussion outside of the committee.
Thank you. Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. Can't get my words out. Thinking about my question. Just on that, I do wonder, if, and it might be actually part of the answer to my question, is whether or not, instead of us having to do another piece of work, whether we just look to change how the plan is presented, so you can see where all the corporate enforcement is done within the different processes. So it might just sort of solve the problem rather than having to do another piece of work. So my question was around third parties and supply management. So obviously, I know you talk about doing a risk-based assessment for the internal audit plan. I would have thought inherently within any organisation, third-party management is probably one of the highest risks that we face. And I know you also talk about contract audits in the types of audits. But what I don't see in the plan is anything specific around invoking our right to audit, which I'm assuming we have in our contracts, which are major suppliers, any supplier really. I don't see that, and I don't really see it coming through in any of the reporting that we've got. And I didn't know whether that was just my misunderstanding, whether or not we actually do invoke it, or whether that's something that actually we do want to look at on the basis that, as I think you've already sort of said, the majority of our spend does go to third parties, and I'm not entirely sure I've seen a huge amount of reporting or controls around how we manage them.
Thank you, Councillor, for the question. So we're in the middle of completing a leisure centres audit. So that leisure centres audit focuses primarily on contract management with Places Leisure. So the vast majority of that audit is actually looking at the obligations on behalf of the third party, Places Leisure, to fully deliver that contract on behalf of the council. So obviously, because that's a very robust, very detailed contract, you would expect there to be rights of access for internal audit, which clearly there is, because I've had separate meetings with the management team over at Places Leisure, and they've been fully supportive of that piece of work. Grounds maintenance is another good example. You'll see that's in the plan. So the majority of grounds maintenance will obviously be delivered under contract, currently with Glendale, I'm assuming. And I would expect, again, because of the complexity of that piece of work and probably the size of the contract, which I don't know exactly what the size is, but I would expect there to be a number of clauses which would allow council officers reasonable access to Glendale's management team and their documentation records. The concern I would have in answering your question would be some of the much smaller contracts. So obviously, if you take Camberley Theatre, for example, we would have a number of contracts with either the agents or the performers. And it's, as far as I understand, some of those contracts are actually the contracts written by the council, and some of the contracts are actually written by the agent or the performer themselves, and we take those on board. And so in my experience, the much smaller contracts would be the ones that I would have the most concerns over in terms of making sure that the contract has been written, or there are provisions or clauses within those contracts to make sure the internal audit function has full access for those third parties to deliver that.
I don't know whether it's possible, but I don't know whether coming back to a future ASR, we could see a list of the contracts or the suppliers, and we could see when they've last been done. Only that, without going into detail of every single supplier that we have, there are probably some suppliers that I would expect to have had some kind of audit performed, none of which you have just mentioned, which I think the ones that you've mentioned sound very sensible. I just wonder whether we get a bit of visibility over which ones have been performed and which ones haven't, and with maybe some sort of materiality in terms of our financial exposure to them.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I think that's quite a reasonable suggestion. I haven't personally seen a particular list of the arrangements the council has with third parties or suppliers, but I dare say that sort of information would be available via Civica, the council's financial system, in terms of the expenditure. But certainly I've had conversations recently with looking at exploring opportunities for looking into the contract or the arrangements with our property agents, for example. And if members remember, 2 or 3 years ago, we did quite a major piece of work on the joint waste contract. And it was agreed after we did that audit that the joint waste contract would be rotated between the 4 parties. So again, that was a major piece of work. But I'm happy to explore areas with which we haven't specifically identified working relationships with suppliers in terms of how internal audit can actually provide added value to that. And to say it's something that I can work with finance, maybe to obtain some sort of financial report that will show the expenditure with those suppliers. But it's a case of how low you go into that granular level of detail. Like, do you take building works, for example? Is that a contract or is that just an expenditure of a piece of work? So I suppose it depends on what we class as a contract, really.
Councillor Lee, then Councillor Cope. He was thinking.
Thanks. When I was reviewing this, I was sort of looking for consistencies across what we've done in previous years and where we've moved away from that to try and get some sort of justification as to why things might change. And the 2 areas that sort of jumped out at me, the first one was grants, where we seem to have reviewed 3 consecutive years and now will not review for 2 years running. And the other one, to a lesser extent, was corporate health and safety. So I just wonder if you could just explain why, we might review those 2 or 3 years in a row and then not review them again. And then just a second minor point, just on the numbers at the bottom where we've listed out training, development, leave, contingency. Your contingency says 25 days times 2, but then equals 60. So should it be 30 times 2, or should the second number be 50?
Yeah, very good spot. That was intentional, just to make sure you're following that. No, so the revised figure was actually 6 days for contingency, but I've omitted to include, it should read 30 days times 2, so apologies for that. If I take the grants query first, looking at the plan then, we did quite a lot of work in 21, 22, 22, 23. I think from memory, a lot of that work was related to COVID-related grants. So back then, obviously, the council was getting probably ad hoc grants, COVID-related, which were being assessed through our revenues and benefits team. Those weren't grants that we're expecting each year. So a lot of it, typically, by tradition, we would audit grants where we'd be looking at grants that the council got on an annual basis, or issuing grants. So it's not just receiving grant monies coming in, it's actually spending grant monies. So obviously in the last couple of years, the amount of grant expenditure that the council's incurred is getting less and less. So in terms of the risk of the authority, that's less. So our community development team, for example, have by tradition the last 2 or 3 years been allocating grants to sports clubs or local clubs or charities. Obviously a lot of that money is now semi-dried up, so that the need to audit that piece of work is less. But I think the main reason why we've grouped 3 consecutive years of grant funding related to the fact that there was a lot of expenditure and potential fraud from third parties actually claiming for grant monies during the COVID time, as you'd expect, that there was increased risk or opportunity for fraudsters to actually claim for grant funding through the local business scheme, things like that. So we actually work with the Res and Bents team to make sure that the grant control processes were as effective as they can be. And in terms of the other audit, can you remind me of the other audit that you had in...
Corporate health and safety, where we just seem to have done it 2 years in a row and then not for 2 years.
Yeah, so corporate health and safety, I think essentially, from memory, the reason it was over 2 years was because the audit started in the 4th quarter of the first year. We identified quite a few issues with the corporate health and safety officer at the time in terms of corporate policy and making sure we were complying with changes in legislation, that I felt rather than cutting off that piece of work at the end of the financial year, we actually carried forward an element of that, and I felt at the time that that was actually providing more added value to the organisation than actually finishing the audit by the end of March that year. So the reason it's in 2 consecutive years was mainly because there was a lot of carry forward of unfinished testing from the previous year, if that makes sense.
Councillor Lee, welcome.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Ted.
So looking through this, it seems quite finance heavy. Obviously looking at how the landscape's changing, obviously finance teams have been resourced up. We now have an active external audit function. Is there perhaps an opportunity to review the level of internal versus external and finance activities, or are you still concerned about controls within the finance area would be my first question. I've got a couple, Chair, forgive me.
It's a very good question. I'm quite happy to take that comment on board. I think traditionally, because they're core audits, that the expectation from both senior management team and external audit would be that the internal audit team needs to adequately do sufficient testing. If we scale back, for example, if you just take, for example, debtors and income, if we scale back the scope of that audit or reduce the amount of tests or the amount of transactions we're able to do, for example, which could be perfectly fair, then external audit may wish to actually carry out more testing themselves. So it's a bit of give and take, I suppose, in that they place a certain amount of reliance that we've tested a sufficient, robust number of transactions in order to demonstrate that the internal controls are being met. So if we scale back the number of transactions or reduce the scope of that audit, because they're financial based and the results of those audits help place reliance on the council's set of accounts, external audit, for example, may wish to challenge us or to have separate meetings with us and say, you know, why have you not covered all the financial year, or why have you reduced so to the, you know, certain number of tests. But obviously that's at the expense, as you said, of other audits and the rest of the organisation, like property or planning. So I think it's trying to strike a balance between the expectation of the senior management team, historically what members and management have expected us to deliver as part of the plan, but also to meet the needs of external audit. And of course, the fee is obviously quite high for external audit, so we have to make sure that we can help complement that piece of work.
Thank you. So 2 more questions. In relation to, I guess in my ward, it's called mergers and acquisitions. So in this instance, we're in effect, in 2 years' time, going to be acquired by a shell operation and merged into with a number of other bodies. So it's thinking about what the audit function would be relevant to the lead up to that acquisition. So looking in terms of things that jump out at me in particular, things like information governance and the quality of that information leading up to that acquisition, because obviously a lot of that historical knowledge and information will need to be transferred into the new organisation. Equally looking around contracts, so we don't really want contracts spilling over beyond the completion of the deal, as it were, i.e. the acquisition, but equally we want that flexibility for some of those contracts to perhaps roll over if there's a delay in the M&A piece, kind of almost like a TSA type model. So it's thinking about whether we've started looking at that in terms of the audit piece to make sure we're not signing a 5-year contract with a supplier, which is not going to be needed for 3 years, so we end up with dead money, as it were.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. Again, very good comments. I think in terms of the LGR, obviously that's a huge risk to not only Surrey Heath, but obviously all the councils that are currently being absorbed by it. I would like to be in a position where internal audit could provide assistance, whether that's from a risk assessment point of view or whether we can carry out any project work in terms of what the council needs to look like in terms of to be in the best position to be transformed into whatever the future landscape of the council is going to look like. But I guess because LGR's only very recently been on the agenda in the landscape, and we're waiting on decisions from government ministers as to what the outcome of that, the new council is going to look like. I suppose it's a bit too soon for us to get involved, but it's certainly something I I would like to get involved with. And it's certainly something that the transformation team probably would be actively encouraging as well, because even though transformation is looking at slightly different aspects of the finance, financial arrangements, there will be a degree of overlap within that as well. So.
I think it's...
Last one.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's obviously crucial to make sure that there is that oversight from an internal audit perspective to that particular piece of work, because it is so fast-paced, to sort of make sure that good practice is flowing through there, because you tend to find when organisations gather pace, as we've seen with the pandemic, with the payout of grants and things, that's where mistakes are more likely to happen, whether they be intended or unintended.
Going back to your second point on the duration of contracts and whether the council's fully managing the expiration or maturity dates of the contract, obviously we've got a procurement piece of work in the annual plan. So an element of the audit could well be to look at, obviously, a list of the current contracts, which we have in the contracts register, and to review what the expiry date of those contracts are, and work with either the procurement manager or the service department themselves to actually see what transitional arrangements they plan or will expect to have in place for when those contracts are due to expire. Obviously, joint waste is probably the biggest one at the moment, because that's obviously 2 or 3 year lead-in time, isn't it, to get the new contract up in place. But certainly for some of the smaller projects, maybe some of the IT or software projects, for example, where the contract period could be 2 or 3 years, and it could well be under the new landscape that we're not going to need 12 different IT solutions. It's something that the team need to make sure that they've got those transition arrangements in place. But it's something I can certainly pick up as part of the procurement's audit.
Thank you. Councillor Noble, then Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed that there is a provision for ICT and cyber audit in the coming sort of year, but emergency planning, business continuity isn't planned for. And I just wonder, in the light of the incident at Heathrow the other week and the outages with Microsoft, for example, whether keeping emergency planning and business continuity off of the programme is actually a wise move. I know that when we went into COVID 5 years ago, it was 5 years ago last weekend, there was a lot of toing and froing within council in trying to get services delivered. And I know things have improved drastically since as a result of that, and organisations like Surrey Heath prepared. But just wonder if maybe we should be looking at emergency planning and business continuity again.
Thank you, Councillor. Another excellent question. I think in terms of emergency planning, the most recent audit we did, obviously, we have again another third party or a working relationship with Applied Resilience, and they obviously do a lot of work on business continuity and emergency planning on our behalf. There are a number of recommendations that we put forward at the last audit, and last year we actually did a follow-up piece of work to make sure that all those recommendations were being fully implemented and applied to. It could be an area I'm quite happy to be open to further discussions as to whether the council feels that needs to be a piece of work that we could consider, or it could well be that we could join that up with the ICT and cyber, for example, because there will be a lot of overlap, because a fair chunk of business continuity will be the ICT related. So it could well be that there could be some sort of synergies with actually doing those pieces of work. I'm not adverse to that either. But I think cyber has been included every year, because cyber is obviously on the forefront of a lot of members and senior officers' minds, and it's something that's clearly not going to go away. And obviously the clear risk to the council is there. But again, I haven't input a huge number of days on ICT and cyber, because we actually get a lot of third parties and other organisations that actually do some sort of penetration testing, and we obviously work with third parties to make sure we've got the cyber essential certificate, is it? Plus, yeah. So internal audit isn't the only assurance provider for cyber and ICT for the council. So, but certainly happy to take it on board and consider that.
Thank you. Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to take a leaf out of Councillor Lee's book and ask more than one question in a row.
No.
So Councillor, you just asked a question about LGR, so I'm not going to ask the same question, but similar, I guess. Obviously, LGR being a massive risk for our council, but all the others as well. And we've talked about how we might, or you've just talked about how we might make sure that the council is in a fit place for the future. But in terms of when we get to that future state, are there any conversations, and I suspect we know the answer, but even if there aren't, it would probably be worth starting conversations around what a post-implementation review might look like, and which would allow districts and boroughs and county council to work out what artefacts and what evidence and information is required so for that end state. I think it's just such a big piece of work with lots of data flows and lots of decisions being made on potentially disparate bits of information that don't always align, that it's beneficial for our residents to know that they have the right decisions or good decisions to be made on the right data at the right times. It's more of a, I don't know whether you've got any comments on that.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I think I'll go further to say, rather than a post-implementation review, we need to seriously consider what milestones the council's senior management team members would want to see in the run-up to the LGRs in terms of how internal audit could actually assist in that process. So there must be a number of key deliverables that the council needs to have in place over the next 2 years, and internal audit could actually work with the senior management team to actually review those deliverables to see if they're being met, or whether we're on time, or whether we're going over time. But in terms of working with other local authorities, we would need to be led by not only Surrey Heath, but obviously how it's going to pan out throughout Surrey wide itself, and we're not going to have a firm steer of that until obviously later on in the year. But it's certainly something we can start to plan for, and to as you said, in terms of the risks to the authority, it's potentially huge to make sure we get it right. But we've got to manage what we can control in terms of there will be a lot of elements that the council hasn't got any control over. So it's a case of what controllables the council's got and where internal audit can help with that piece of work.
Thank you. I guess just to finish on that one, we've got, obviously at the end, our borough won't exist. So in some ways, I'm thinking more of what the bigger picture, so where we end up reporting into. Yeah. Along the same line, transformation agenda. Obviously, we're doing lots of work on that. Very exciting. Lots of effort is going into it. I think there's also a risk as with any project type work, that the ambition set out at the beginning isn't always adhered to by the end, or can't be delivered. And I wondered whether we'd given any thought to whether there's any type of reviews that need to take place between now and delivery of the transformation agenda.
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't given it any detailed consideration at the moment, but it's certainly something that I feel will certainly benefit the transformation project, as well as the council's finances, to make sure we're actually delivering it right. And that equally applies to other projects across the council. So we don't have, as an authority, because we're relatively small, we don't have dedicated project managers or programme managers in the council. We certainly have a lot of skills in place to make sure the project is being delivered, and I dare say a lot of senior officers are Prince 2 qualified, but a lot of those pieces of work will be absorbed within the delivery of their day-to-day jobs. So to me, that's as much of a risk to the authority than the transformation project itself being met. So it's certainly something I'm happy to consider, and again, that's part of the reason for having a contingency element within the annual plan to take on board these additional pieces of work.
My final question, I think. One of the things that has struck me over however many months is that often there are requests for pieces of work which include a monetary, financial impact to the council. and often they then require going out to tender. And the view that I have, which might be incorrect, is that that number comes in at a figure that seems reasonable to allow that piece of tendering work to start, and then the final figure at the end bears very little resemblance to the figure we started with. And I just wondered whether there is a piece of work that we need to do around looking at the integrity of data that we have at the beginning of that project, and whether or not we're doing the right type of processing in order to get it to that first hurdle.
Yes, it's a fair point. I would say as a starting point, we've obviously would rely on the council's finance team. We obviously have capital budgetary controls in place, capital budget monitoring. So the main purpose of that will be to check the milestones of spend against capital projects. So I would expect the finance business partners to be meeting with the key stakeholders, looking at their budget lines, looking at their expenditure, and making sure that those budgets are being spent as per the initial scope of the outline of the project. So our role as internal audit would be to check the process of budget monitoring and make sure it's robust, and that the information being derived from Civica is actually fit for purpose. It's going back to your reliability of the data. We've got to make sure that the reports come through from Civica, which are being used by the council's finance business partners, are actually fit for purpose, and they're actually being fully utilised with those meetings with the service teams. But like any audit, if there is an element of project management within that particular audit, it's not something we wouldn't consider reviewing. So, for example, parking, they've taken on the new ANPR system in the last 12 months, and part of the audit actually looked at the project management arrangements in place to fully deliver the ANPR work. So we do actually absorb some project management reviews within the audit, but we don't actually have a specific audit that just looks at project management and making sure that the key milestones and the projects come in to time and to cost. We haven't got that, but again, it's something that we could consider if it's a worthwhile exercise.
I think I just worry that sometimes to get to the first part of that process, numbers are plucked out of the air to allow the process to start, as opposed to necessarily throughout the lifetime of the actual project once it's been given the go-ahead. But maybe that's just something we can reflect on.
Okay. Any other questions? Sean, do you wish to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and apologies to the members for being larger than life today. Oh, turn the volume down. I'll speak more softly. Okay, I really have turned it down. Two things. First of all, I agree with what Councillor McIntyre was saying, which is I think our project budgeting is about as reliable as spinning a dartboard at the moment and throwing a dart at it in terms of its accuracy. So I do think there is something in that, because once we are committed to a project, it's very difficult to disengage from a project, and therefore we have to get better, I think, at trying to get the initial estimate as accurate as possible. I think we're outside the boundaries of what is acceptable at the moment, the variance we're seeing on various things. My main point, though, Mr. Middleton, again, thank you for your report, was if we were to benchmark ourselves against other Surrey councils and look at the people days that we're investing in our audit plan, how do we compare as best as possible on a like-for-like basis? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, some valid points. I don't have benchmarking data to hand, so in terms of answering that specific question, I would have to go away and investigate that. But my suggestion would be, my experience would be, the council used to work in a triangular partnership with Spelthorne and Elmbridge, as you know, and at that time, both Elmbridge and Spelthorne had a higher headcount than Surrey Heath did, and that was when we were in the partnership. Obviously, that partnership came to a termination for a number of reasons. I'm not aware of any councils in Surrey that operate with just one headcount. I think, obviously, the delivery of the audits and any contingency or consultancy work you'll be able to give will be quite limited, and you may have to focus on the core fundamental audits, such as the ones at the top of the annual plan in terms of how external audit would relate to those. But again, I'm happy to go away and take on board your comments and do some benchmarking. But I feel for some of that, it would be the number of days that the audit teams are delivering rather than the actual headcount themselves. So they, a lot of those teams would actually only be providing a number of specific internal audits, and there won't be any scope out to deviate from that piece of work.
Thank you.
Any more? Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. As we touched on cyber security, I did a quick Google of the council's website. There's never any mention of Cyber Essentials Plus. It's very important. There's two standards. The Cyber Essentials, which is called Mark Your Own Homework. So that's not really worth the paper it's printed on. It's Cyber Essentials Plus, which is externally assessed, that adds value and is very important there. When you're doing the cyber security audit, a question I would ask, so I've looked through the council's suppliers, and they buy in what's called a SEAM solution. So this is where all your computer logs get pulled into one place. I'd ask the council, when you're doing the audit, how many systems that produce computer logs don't feed into that system, because ideally it should be all of them. And the second question I'd ask is, it's great having all those logs in one place, but who's monitoring them 24/7 for security threats and vulnerabilities? Because hackers tend to start work about 7 o'clock on a Friday evening. They're normally in the organisation by 11 o'clock at night, and you normally find out about 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning when someone can't get in. That's from first-hand experience in dealing with these incidents. So it's understanding what happens outside the 9 to 5. And I would ask those questions: who's watching before 9 a.m. before staff start, and who's watching after 5 p.m. Because those are the kind of the BAU window for not hacking is Monday to Friday 9 to 5 because staff are working. We're just coming up to Easter. That's a real ripe time where actually they'll pivot their time for breaking into a Thursday evening, because that gives them 4 days. So they're a bit like normal people. They have normal business operations and they work out the sweet spot for breaking in. So those are a couple of questions that if I was doing a cyber audit, I would certainly ask and expect to see a list of systems that are not pouring in currently, and then ask the question, which one's the highest risk? I hope that helps.
Thank you. Okay. Any more? Nope. Okay. Councillors, we are invited to resolve that we've noted the risk-based approach and noted and approved the proposed annual plan. Are we in agreement with that? Perfect. Thank you very much. Next item, item 7, outstanding audit recommendations. I guess this is you again.
It's me again. Thank you, Chair. I've saved the best report to last because this is probably the most exciting report of the night in comparison to the audit charter, shall we say. So in terms of the report then, obviously the main objectives of the report are to provide members with a summary of all the audit recommendations that have been raised and agreed with the management team here over the last 18 months. So it's, the report and the spreadsheet in particular is over a last 18-month period. The vast majority of the audit recommendations, members will be glad to hear, have been fully actioned and implemented, so I've been able to close those off. The ones that are still outstanding or are not yet due are those highlighted in beige. I'm not sure if you've got a colour scheme of grey and beige on your spreadsheet, but the ones that are still outstanding or not yet due are beige. The ones I think members will be keen on this evening would be to have a quick discussion about the overdue recommendations. So these are the ones that where the target date has now passed and the recommendation, according to the internal audit team, hasn't been satisfactorily closed off. So the first 6 still relate to bid. They're still on the report, and members will note that the original target date was March 24, so they're now 12 months overdue. I've recently had some information from one of the senior accountants within the finance team. So essentially, the council's had a few meetings with the bid chair and the bid team to move these recommendations forward, and it was agreed that an independent firm of accountants called Menzies would be appointed to have a look or investigate the income and expenditure. So the council has now provided all the reconciliation information as I understand it, and has provided the answers to initial queries from Menzies. So the information, as I understand, now sits with Menzies accountants to carry out their piece of work and then provide their response as a result of that. To be honest with you, I don't know the timescales for that piece of work or when they're planning on returning that. Perhaps the Chief Executive may have an idea of that. But those are the 6 relating to bid. The bottom one, relating to safeguarding, has now been actioned. So apologies for that, because it's been actioned since this report was written. So I've been informed by the head of service that arrangements are now in place where the team have introduced regular meetings with the safeguarding champions. So there are a number of champions across the council that talk about safeguarding issues generally, and an agenda item has now been added to each of these meetings where continuous development through the process of debriefing on safeguarding cases is actually considered. So every time there's a safeguarding referral or a specific need or requirement, that piece of work will actually be discussed at those meetings, and then the members of staff can obviously have a debrief or consider whether there should be any lessons learnt or what particular policies need to change, whether the safeguarding policy needs to change or whether any practices need to be put in place to make sure that those incidents are minimised for the future. So from an internal audit point of view, I'm quite satisfied that that action has now been implemented, so we can close that one off. So that leaves the Treasury one. So that Treasury one relates to information that was being retained or not retained as part of our transactional testing. So the council's moved from box records to SharePoint, and one of the resulting consequences of that, not all approval records were actually being cited by the internal audit team, or not all the records were being available. So we raised that issue with the ICT team, and we're informed that whilst we're still developing SharePoint and the governance arrangements behind the governance tools, they haven't actually fully implemented those governance arrangements yet due to conflicts in priority. So it's something we have flagged up with the ICT team. They know it's an issue, but it's something in terms of they need to either prioritise it higher or can only actually implement and deal with it when they have the resources to do so. So at the moment, unfortunately, that still sits on the overdues recommendations report, and the other 6 relate to bid. So that's the current position. Chair, I'm happy to take questions on those or the rest of the recommendations that are in the report more generally.
Thank you. Members, any questions? Councillor Cope?
Can I ask the question that was prompted in terms of the bid? What is the sort of most up-to-date status and timelines? Because I'm just conscious this has been on there, I think, since I've been a member of the council, so it'd be quite nice to see it moved off.
Do we know any more other than you understand the issue?
Yeah, I understand the issue. I was just wondering about the timeline for the Menzies report, because I think Alex said he didn't know, but he said Nick might know. So
Yes, there's someone who might know.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Cope. I'm glad Mr. Middleton feels that I might know. In fact, I don't. My involvement in this stopped essentially after the initial conversation with Menzies and our previous Section 151 officer and the chair of the bid. It was then handed over to our finance team, but clearly between December and now, the finance team have been quite busy with budget setting and everything else. So the information has been provided. Some of the additional questions and queries have been responded to. We will provide an update from Menzies once we have one.
We are waiting for accountants again.
But
Councillor McIntyre.
Sorry.
Nick, did you want to say something?
if I may just clarify, Chair, we will chase Menzies to get an indication of when they will come to a conclusion.
Thank you. Councillor McIntyre.
Sorry, I did a very excited hand raise when I thought you were about to bring the item to a close. Just a couple of questions. On the list of all actions, there's quite a few from the fraud audit, which will make a lot of sense. And maybe it's a slightly unfair question because I don't have an answer. But one of the things that strikes me about fraud is the potential for conflict of interest or insider sort of threat type things, or information usage that either as councillors we get or officers have access to, and we rely very much on self-disclosure. Is there anything within anything that happened within the fraud audit or any other audit where we could look for underreporting or any conflicts of interest that may not be disclosed?
It's a good point. I think the policy from memory has been written in such a way that it clearly identifies any potential sanctions or any disciplinary if it's found that either officers or members haven't disclosed anything where they should have done. I think the code of conduct for both members and officers makes that quite clear. There clearly is a reliance on honesty here in terms of what officers or members disclose in terms of pecuniary or non-pecuniary interests, or in terms of hospitality, gifts and hospitality, for example. So the policy is very much a self-referral process. It would be difficult for internal audit to actually spot any individual or specific examples where either an officer hasn't disclosed a pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest or declaration of interest on something they could have a conflict of interest on. That would be quite unusual to actually spot that. I think we'll be relying on speak up policy or the whistleblowing policy, for example, where members of the public or another member of staff could actually identify where they've overheard a potential conflict of interest and they feel that it's sufficiently material to warrant that disclosure through the speak up policy, and that's what that policy is there for, to enable members of staff or residents of the council to actually feel confident enough to actually disclose anything like that. And that will be down to, obviously, HR to take that forward if there is a particular breach in that code of conduct. But as I say, I think the policy is very much on a trust basis, and the reliance, just like on any transaction, would be on the member of staff or the member to actually make sure they're disclosing when they should be. I suppose the only grey area would be where they feel that they're not actually sure whether they should actually be disclosing something in the first place because they feel that it may not actually be a conflict of interest, but it's probably better to err on the side of caution than actually take the opposite view, I think.
Thank you. And just my final question, I think. I appreciate this is all about internal audit, so maybe this is not really a question for you, but maybe Mrs. Radford. External audit, which I know comes up in September 25, I think, according to the forward plan for the actions. I just wondered whether or not we wanted, as a committee, to have more regular reporting on the status of external audit actions. So even if external audit themselves haven't provided the status update or closed things, whether we wanted to see more up-to-date reporting, and that could potentially then be linked with the internal audit reporting. It's an open question to everyone, really. I don't really know who I'm looking at.
Anybody have any views on Councillor McIntyre's idea? Brilliant idea. maybe something to think about.
I think my thinking was one of the audit actions from memory was around specific training for councillors around, I think it was Treasury, there was certainly some finance training, which obviously will be implemented. And it was just the one thing on my mind. I don't know how far down the road we are in any of the actions, and I think maybe a bit more transparency across the council would probably be quite helpful, given the interest that the external audit report generated when they came in.
Well, there was novelty value, wasn't there, in that report. We did, I think, at the last meeting, discuss the possibility of having 6-month interim review, but that is part of the normal process, I believe. So that was kind of a defunct idea. Councillor Noble, you had a hand.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of formulate my thoughts. So I suppose I need to declare, I suppose, that I was once an auditor, gave it up as quickly as I could. But in terms of accountability during the financial year for end of year audit, I don't know that it's going to be that easy to put a system in place. Certainly sort of preparation towards the year end audit, maybe it's not Q2 report, it's a Q3 report looking ahead for the year end might be beneficial, so that we can see that the external audit will be under control and delivered in an efficient manner. But I did want to just sort of say that looking at the audit outcomes here and the fact that so many of them have been cleared, I think it's the officers and team should be commended on the fact that the recommendations that have been made have in the main been processed and seen through and actioned, and that we are now left with a few, most of which are grouped around one situation with the bid. So I think that's commendable. So thank you to all the officers.
Yes, thank you. I heartily agree. Things are a lot better than they were at one time. I think we ought to leave it there. Thank you for the idea. Did you have a question? You may ask your question.
You're very kind, Chair. Thank you. Perhaps you thought I was so excited with Councillor McIntyre putting her hand up, I just sort of followed on as if we were going to do a Mexican hands up wave. I just want to touch on the tidy up of, I think it's information security policies. Doesn't seem quite there when I look at the website. So, for example, the breach policy references a number of other policies that aren't currently there. So I'm wondering, were you comfortable that had been closed out with all of the policies being put in place consistently?
Are you referring to a specific line number, Councillor? I'm just trying to follow your question. Or just was that a comment generally about information management?
Sorry, it's page 35, penultimate line. It's recommended that the Information Governance Manager and HR consider cleaning up the key policies and procedures listed by removing the older versions of the policies from the list stroke folder and placing them with the new versions. Perhaps the old ones have been removed, but the new versions haven't been put up there. I've just hopped onto the website. I can find the 2011 information security policy, but can't find the current one. Perhaps I'm not looking hard enough. I'm on the policies page plus Google.
So the version you can see is 2011. So we're talking about 14 years ago.
Yes, that is correct. That's as of about 30 seconds ago when I Googled.
Okay.
Well, I say 30 seconds, about 10 minutes now.
I can't comment upon that, but when I last looked at the area within the council system that was had logged those particular policies, my version was actually the current one, because I could see the version control of when the information security policy was reviewed and when it was agreed. So maybe if I don't know if it's been taken down for revision or something like that, and you're seeing the older version, but I can't answer why it's showing 2011 because the version I saw was the most recent, the current version.
I'm on the public website. There's a
Happy to.
section called Policies and Procedures. It talks about the data security breach management policy and data protection policy, but doesn't have the policies that it references in those policies to be read in conjunction with them. So if you're reading them, you wouldn't be able to read them in conjunction. I suspect it's probably a gremlin in the IT system. They happen.
I have to admit, I believe that the IS policy was actually not a public policy. I think the one that you probably audited, Alex, I could be wrong here, but was the Warbler one.
Yeah.
I didn't believe that the IS policy, so I'm actually quite manically trying to find where you found it on the public site. But we will definitely look into that because that's I believe why the old version's there. It was obviously a very historic version. So thank you.
I believe it went through a committee. Also in the information breach, there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 policies it references, which if it's a public document, one assumes the public would need to see those policies that it links to, otherwise it wouldn't be complete.
And from a layman's point of view, if the public are seeing stuff that's dated a long time in the past, that might give the impression that, ooh, we can get in here and increase the likelihood of an attack.
I'm happy to take that away and work with the Council's Information Governance Manager in IT to make sure that wherever possible the Council links are up to date and working properly, and we can report back to you at the next committee. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Any more on this? Nope. Okay, are we resolving to do anything with this or just note it? I can't get the right thing up on my screen, but then I always blame me for that. We're just noting this, okay, so duly noted. Thanks, Alex. Are we corporate risk register? Yeah. Now, item 8 on the agenda. Sally.
Thank you, Chair. So the corporate risk register comes to this committee every 6 months for your review and comment. The corporate risk register is the register of corporate risks the council is facing. Sorry. Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. So yes, the corporate risk register is the register of all the key corporate strategic risks facing the council. The corporate risk register is reviewed by the Corporate Risk Management Officers Group on a quarterly basis. And just as a reminder, the Corporate Risk Management Officers Group is made up of a representative from all of these services. Each service area does have their own risk register. Any high risks are raised at the Corporate Risk Management Officers Group via the representative for consideration and discussion as to whether they should be added to the corporate register. So the corporate register that you hopefully have in front of you is the track changes version. The tracked changes are all the changes that have happened in the last 6 months since the last time this committee reviewed the register. You will notice that we have included now a motion indicator on the risk post-mitigation revised score, and that is just to simplify for you the fact that how the risk has moved over the last 6 months. So if there's an upwards arrow, the risk has increased. If it's a horizontal, it stayed static. If it's a downwards arrow, it has decreased, and then a star indicates a new risk, so nothing to compare to. I won't go over every individual risk, but just to pick out the key points. You will notice that we have removed 2 of the risks over the last 6 months. The first one being old risk 8, which was the contaminated land. Risk assessments have been completed on the lands and they came back as low and being managed with minimal intervention, and therefore we believe that the risk had been reduced to such a low risk that they should be removed from the corporate register but are still being reviewed on the service risk register. We also removed old risk 9, which was vulnerable people. This was a risk that was originally on the register due to a concern around the cleanliness of the vulnerable people in Surrey and how the agencies across Surrey were managing that list in the event of an emergency. We do now have, or Surrey County Council have, a system that we do feed into on a very regular basis, so we are now confident that vulnerable people will be supported in the event of an emergency, and that list is clean. So therefore that risk is reduced, so again it was determined that it should be removed from the corporate register. You will see we have also included 2 new registers, 2 new risks, risk 11, retention and recruitment. I think we could probably all appreciate that with the current situation with Surrey Heath as well as local government, risk of losing staff is high, and if we lose key staff, skilled staff, we may struggle to recruit those in the current climate, and therefore it is believed that there should be a separate risk. We have also included a local government reorganisation risk, even though local government and transformation really does run through all of the risks and probably will impact on a lot of the risks over the coming year or 2. It was just believed that it should have its own separate risk line because there are obvious risks around the fact that at the moment it's very much the unknown. We don't know what funding is going to be required. We don't know how the impact is going to be on staff and the capacity of staff, how that is going to affect services. So it was determined that there should be a risk, a separate risk dedicated to it on the register. That was all I was going to say at this point, but I'm happy to take any comments or questions, and I will certainly try to answer them.
Thank you. Members, you've had a good look at the risk register. Councillor McIntyre.
Thank you. I really like the way that risk register is written. I think it's really clear. I only had one point, which is probably just a preferential thing. The loss of funding risk, which is obviously about us having insufficient funds to fund the council services. I personally feel it doesn't read as strongly as possibly it could. I almost feel it should be inadequate funding as opposed to loss of funding or insufficient funding. But that's just a preference from my point of view. And the other excellent point I had has just gone straight out of my mind. Risk appetite. Previously, we talked about having risk appetite, and I don't see it within any of the papers that we have and on the risk register. I just wondered where we were with that.
So yeah, the risk appetite was written, and it did come to the last committee in September. I did receive a few comments from the councillors, so it is now part of the strategy, the risk management strategy, but would absolutely value your views on that.
Okay. You have a question?
Thank you, Chair. I have a question and a statement. First off, great piece of work. It really brings the whole piece to life really effectively. That front sort of single pane of glass to give you that kind of C-suite overview is absolutely brilliant. It's bang on the money. It is great. I've got to say, if more corporates adopted that really simple pane of glass, the corporate world would be in a better place. This is an outstanding piece of work, in my humble opinion. I am but one person. I think the direction of travel piece is really, really crucial as well. Thank you very much for that. That's a real big help. I note that since previous discussions, the direction of travel that we highlighted as a risk around Treasury has clearly been looked at in detail, and obviously we've seen a movement in that. Thank you for driving that piece of work to look at it and properly assess it to determine whether it needed a direction of travel change. Thank you. I had a quick look around ICT. It seems to be an ICT evening this evening. ICT people, you're amazing. That's the right camera. ICT people, you're amazing. You're the glue that holds everyone together. Thank you. There was a piece around risk assessments and DPIAs for third parties. It was interesting to see it was a IT-led piece of work. My observation being that the business owns that data, not IT. So the business needs to, or the business units need to have ownership of their data and lead on that, because they're the subject matter experts on what that data is, how it should be processed. So I actually think, slightly mean of me, that's a business responsibility that ICT would have oversight of, not an ICT process they do for the business. Because much that the IT team will be awesome, understanding how certain obscure processes work would fall within those business functions, would be my observation. But that's just an observation. And obviously, the continued... I've just praised the IT team and I get turned off. Clearly someone's trying to override the IT team. Obviously, the tech maturity is moving in the right direction, but it's relatively immature at those levels, and hence my question about the scene piece that's highlighted in those.
Don't panic. Have you made your point?
I think it's back again. So again, it's that next step. What's the next step in terms of that maturity piece? Collect the logs, but what happens next? You can put all the paper in a filing cabinet, but do we need to do something with it?
Thank you. No? Anybody else? Any comments? Questions? No? Excellent. Thank you. Are we just noting this one?
Yes, unless you have anything else. Unless you have anything else you want to particularly draw out.
No? No? We're just noting this. Thank you very much. Treasury Q3 monitoring report.
Thank you. This is obviously a standard report that you've seen throughout the financial year. From the new financial year, as a result of the refreshed capital investment strategy, there will be some more detail and it will be updated for you. The borrowing and investment balances show as at December. So tonight I can give you the figures as at the end of February. So for external borrowing, we had 199.8 million. We now have 180.9, so it's reduced. And our investment balances show as 47.45 million, and it's come down to 19.22 million. And that is as expected, and I've said in the previous meeting, the borrowing, the investment balances have reduced because we've repaid some of that borrowing. But also because February and March, we don't get our council tax, mostly because most people pay over 10 months. So that's what we call our sort of famine months. As more expenditure goes out the door because more invoices are paid because it's coming up to year end. So cash flow wise, that's why that's moved. The interest projections are as they are in the report. That was as at more up-to-date figures than December. So I can confirm that we are currently projecting £1 million worth of investment income as a result of higher interest rates. They didn't come down as much as we expected. against the budget of 100,000, and the borrowing is the same, about 6.9 million against the budget of 2.1, which we obviously all know that is a big budget gap for us. No issues against the breaching any of the potential indicators. So that's all I want to say. So open the floor.
Thank you. Members, any questions for Vicky? Rob?
It does demonstrate to the auditors who may watch this on catch-up that we don't talk to each other in between audit meetings on audit stuff. Going to 3.2, which is on page 45, there's a line that references local authority. I assume that's just a catch-all description. It's not necessarily local authorities. It's that kind of pot of short-time borrowing, but we try and roll it through local authorities because I think there was a building society in there. So I just wanted to double-check the local authority bit was just a general heading, as it were.
No, the local authorities should just be local authorities, but I will just check that if there was the building society and that obviously hasn't been brought through into the summary table correctly. So it would just be local councils, so that's incorrect.
Okay, it's reasonable to assume I've misread it. It wouldn't be the first time.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any questions? No?
Chair.
Oh,
I
I
think the short-term borrowing is Furness Building Society was the one that I spotted in there amongst the local authorities, unless I've misunderstood the layout. Is that my error?
Just looking at the detail on page 51, there is a building society in there, which, when was that maturing? Yeah, that's still on hold, so yeah, that summary table's incorrect.
Okay, cool. Sorry, thank you.
All okay now? Yeah? Okay. Thank you. We are noting this report. Report noted. Thank you. Annual standards report from the monitoring officer. Parishes.
Thank you, Chair. This is the annual monitoring officer's report to this committee, which is just for noting. We will see within the report I've set out the number of code of conduct complaints that were received for the period November 23 to November 24, and also the number of contract waivers that were authorised by the council for the same period, and also the use of the powers under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. So just going back to the Code of Conduct, for the period November 23 to November 24, there were 17 complaints received by the monitoring officer, and 16 of those were resolved informally or not deemed to merit further investigation. And there hasn't been training on Code of Conduct since 2023, so that's something I'd like to address this year. So I'll arrange for some training on Code of Conduct. Moving on to the Regulation of Investigatory Powers, like most local authorities, it's not really used by local authorities. That's the ability to undertake covert surveillance for our investigations, and it wasn't used for that period of November to November. And lastly, on to the number of contract waivers that were authorised by the monitoring officer together with the Section 151 officer, and they were 25, which may sound high, but based on the number of contracts there are, that's not too bad. We've got obviously our procurement manager who is more carefully monitoring how procurement is undertaken in the council, and I understand there's going to be some training on Warbler for staff, and so that I think that number's probably about right. So that's it, unless there are any questions.
Thank you. Members, any questions? Councillor McIntyre.
It seems a lot of work and effort from complaints generated from people. In your experience, is it a similar level to other districts, boroughs, regions, or do we have a disproportionate number of or amount of activity in that area?
It is a lot of work, I'll agree with you. So just using my previous two authorities as a comparison, I worked for Broxbourne Council and they didn't have parish councils and we never had any code of conduct complaints. I may have maybe one every other year. The other council I worked for had 24 parish councils and there were a huge amount of code of conduct complaints. I'm not sure exactly why. That creates more code of conduct issues, but it just seems to. And in comparison with colleagues in other local authorities, that is about that number. But it is a lot of work. Definitely.
It's worth bearing in mind for the LGR structure, isn't it, if there's going to be more parish and town councils?
Councillor Lee.
I wasn't going to mention the complaints piece, but my wonder is whether that function could be delegated down to parishes. They fund it themselves, just as a thought. The £2 million worth of expenditure as a percentage of turnover from a corporate perspective seems quite high. How do you feel about the £2 million there? Is that a large number compared to other local authorities, or is that routine there, would you say? I'm not saying, I've moved on to, paragraph 1.7 on page 56, 1.7 on page 56. So it was the 2 million there as a percentage of turnover or percentage of revenue.
Firstly, I'll pick up your point about the parish councils. That's something I've thought about, and I tried to implement that in my last authority, where we would charge parish councils for code of conduct complaints for dealing with them as a way of deterring or reducing the number of complaints received. Obviously, there's a lot of pushback on that. The legislation, the Localism Act, requires that the district council and county council have in place a procedure for dealing with code of conduct complaints. It doesn't say you can't charge for it, but I think parish councils see that as it's the responsibility of the district council. So that's something I'd like to pursue as an option, as a way of managing the number of complaints going forward.
Plus also presumably managing costs, because we're not a voluntary organisation, as it were. So presumably for the other services that we provide to parishes, we do charge for it, one assumes, with the exception, obviously, collection of council tax, when if it's not paid, we still get to pay the parish the amount that they're due.
Councillor Cope, then Councillor Taylor.
There's the second part of the question related to the amount of the value of the contracts that waivers were issued for. I can't compare to other councils. I don't know that information. But looking back previously at this authority's number of waivers, it's there or thereabouts. It's a little bit higher because if you looked at the Annex 1, there's some figures in there that relate to the joint waiver contract dispute. So I think that's skewed it slightly. but taking that out, it's comparable to other years.
Sorry, back Councillor Cope, then Councillor Tedder.
Just on the point around sort of parish, borough code of conduct complaints, are you able to provide us a breakdown of how many of these 17 relate to parish councillors, how many relate to borough councils, just so that we can understand what it looks like in Surrey Heath?
So we had, the majority were from parish councils. I think only 3 related to the borough and the rest were parish councils.
Okay. Councillor Tedder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure whether I should declare a non-pecuniary interest in this, as I am a parish councillor.
You know more about it than we do. On the whole issue, there having been one full investigation in which 3 of us were involved, a number of officers were involved. It was a pretty toothless activity. And as far as I know, as of yesterday, the recommendation that we made, that somebody apologise to somebody else, has not been fulfilled. So, you know, was it a waste of time? Yes, in that sense. Is there anything we can do about it? You know, hot irons or cattle prods or anything?
Thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, that is a problem with the regime. Under the Localism Act, we're required to have a code of conduct. We're required to have a procedure in place for dealing with alleged breaches of the code. But there are no sanctions. There are no powers to impose serious sanctions, which I think would have more of an impact. It relies on resolving conflict informally. I think the government's thinking behind the Localism Act in 2011 was that if the residents were unhappy with their elected members, they would respond through the ballot box, as opposed to officers or maybe a committee having the power to perhaps disqualify or suspend a member.
Doesn't. Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you. Are we able to publicise the outcome of that episode or not?
My understanding is that it will be, the minutes and the conclusion will be a publicly available document. Is that correct?
That's right, yes. So that's a form of sanction in that it's published.
So we could issue a press release, for example, or bring the might of the communications department to bear on this matter in other ways.
Well, I suppose anything's possible.
If I could just comment that people who are elected, speaking as one of them, do not like negative publicity.
Whereas others thrive on it. Councillor Lee.
I'm wondering, Chair, if it's too naughty to express our support for charging for our services that are being utilised by other authorities. As a committee, I don't know if that's overstepping the mark, but it's a thought, given that you know, it's public money that's being spent here, and it's public money that actually could be funding meals on people's tables. For the elderly, it's public money that could be funding vital services for people that are in need, as opposed to individuals who choose not to keep a civil tongue in their head. And I think that that's a really serious point here, because this is an utter waste of this local authority's money and the time of good, hard-working officers who actually have some really important work to do here, as opposed to have to, deal with petty squabbles from, I wouldn't even call them children, it would be an insult to children in parish authorities, which is just unacceptable. So I don't know if we can reasonably sort of offer our support to those local authorities being charged for the utilisation of our time.
I totally agree. I think the idea of Ms Boateng about charging back is something that we should investigate with vigour.
Thank you, Chair. I'll definitely do that.
And I think I could say for all of us that we would be supportive of your activities in that direction.
Can we have what you've just said as a resolution in the minutes, please, Chair? Even if we need to push it to a vote.
Yeah, if you're proposing that. Councillor Whitcroft?
Personally, before I think that matter warrants some investigation first, and I think it's probably more appropriate if that item be added to the committee's work programme when we come to that item a bit later. Just a thought.
Councillor Cope?
Yes, I agree with what Councillor Whitcroft just said. I mean, in principle, I don't particularly have an issue with it. I'm just sort of thinking it through. If we've got a statutory obligation to provide this service, then presumably the parish council can't provide it on its own, which could cause them a bit of a problem with some sort of endless loop of constant complaints that we then have to deal with, that they then have to pay for. I just feel it needs to be thought about a little bit. I don't disagree with the principle, but I just feel there's quite a bit to think through before saying it's definitely the way to go.
Yeah, I think we.
What I'm not clear on is, can parish councils investigate their own complaints under the statute, or is it the responsibility of the borough council under statute?
It's the responsibility of the monitoring officer for the borough council.
So, I think we're all agreed. Carry on. Investigate, and you'll have our support. Yes? Yes. Okay, thank you. Councillor MacDonald, do you have a hand raised?
I do. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just a couple of different things. Just linking to the conversation, Councillor Cope kindly took 80% of my question to Ms Boateng, and thank you for your report. Could you just give us a quick insight into the breakdown by parish council? That's an initial point. I apologise if I've been too loud. I'll turn it back a bit.
Right, so for the period last year, I can't tell you which parish councils. The information just said that I looked at just indicated whether it was a borough or parish council complaint. I gather from looking at previous reports and notes on complaints, it seems to vary. So you may have one year where it tends to be one parish council and then it moves to another. So this year, most of my complaints are from one parish council at the moment.
Thank you. And if it's okay, Chair, just a couple of quick things. I mean, the members might remember there was a consultation around changing the regime and sanctions, which we're all encouraged to participate in. And I think the government is considering strengthening those. I think that's still an active programme ongoing. So obviously we'll take that on board when it flows through. I think the other thing maybe for members just to be aware is that I have discussed, and Mr Stevens might want to comment or at least validate this is the case. I have discussed with the other group leaders that we are aware and cognizant, all members should be cognizant of the cost of these investigations, and look to avoid complaints, first of all by compliance, and then secondly by trying to follow informal apologies routes. That said, I have raised 3 complaints, including the one all at Surrey level, by the way. Sorry, 1 at borough level, 2 at Surrey level, including 1 today, and the one that was referenced. So I think we do have to occasionally do it, but we should be mindful of it. And lastly, I think the minutes of that previous one have now been made public, according to another member. So whilst it's maybe not appropriate, as it's a non-executive function for us to influence, well, it is for the committee, but not for me, to influence the monitoring officer and the chief executive in this. It's certainly a reasonable course of action to publicise their outcomes via something like a press statement. And I'm sure they give that due consideration.
Okay. Thank you. Are we resolving or are we noting?
Chair, I think Councillor Whitcroft proposed it be added to this work programme for monitoring. I'm full support of that.
Yeah.
In terms of the recovery of funds from parishes.
Committee, I was just suggesting that we sort of add the following to the committee's resolution, the endorsement. So it would be the committee agrees to the endorsement of exploration of the charging for monitoring officer investigations of complaints against parish councillors. I'm sure we can tidy up the wording, but that's, I think, what you were getting at.
That's correct, and also the existing one, if we can charge for that as well, I think that would help focus the mind.
We can certainly look at that, yes. It involving a KC or as well.
Subcommittee.
Yes. Talking of that particular case, the minutes of that subcommittee have been circulated. Anybody object? I'm about to sign them.
Chair, I have a question in relation to those minutes.
I'll ask a question.
Okay. Has the person being complained about had a fair and legal right to exhaust all appeals in law?
Yes, there is no appeal against a code of conduct determination. There's no legal, unless judicial review maybe, or to the local government ombudsman if they feel that the investigation wasn't conducted properly. But otherwise, within the councils, no, there's no other appeal process.
So this is the first part of an investigation and a finding, and there's no right of appeal.
I think that meeting was the last part of the investigation. The first part of the investigation was carried out by officers who made the recommendation to this committee that it be investigated, and Councillors Cope, McIntyre and myself reviewed the papers, spoke to the individual who had representation, and it was clear in the papers that this was the final stage and there was no appeal.
And it was said to him at the subcommittee as well.
Yes, it was said in the subcommittee as well.
Forgive me digging slightly on this. So, was this the first point that he was found in breach of the Code of Conduct, or was there a previous hearing to find him in breach? What I'm trying to establish is there a right of appeal for this finding is really important, because if, say for example, I'm convicted in a court of law for stealing apples, I have a right of appeal. What I'm trying to establish in this process is there a right of appeal? It's a really important point for me.
Chairman, shall I? No, there is no right of appeal.
Councillor Whitcroft.
According to the resolution on this, you mentioned as chair of the subcommittee that no apology had been received as requested.
Not as of yesterday.
Fine. Do we know if the second part of that, the removal of any social media posts which could be considered as offensive, do we know if have we got any way of knowing whether they've been removed?
Not by me. No, I don't know.
I don't believe they have been removed, no.
The individual concerned, after the judgment was given, asked how far back we wanted the things removed from, and the reply was that it is up to him what he removes. And nothing has been done. You won't get anywhere, I don't think, with this, but carry on.
That's okay. I think there's two pieces to this. There's the process that's been followed here, and there's the normal common process of a right of appeal. I can have a personal opinion on this and what I think, but I think there's clearly a lacking piece of the legislation to give that right of appeal. I hear the judicial review, but you have to have very deep pockets for that. And I'm just thinking there's something not 100% right about the process we've been given to work within. I'm not questioning whether we followed due process here. The evidence seems to present that we've been pretty accurate and spot on with it. The bit that's concerning me is the fact the wider process doesn't seem quite right to me. It doesn't feel like a good piece of government legislation if there isn't a right of appeal. And equally, it dovetails in with another point that you've made, which is that there's no right of reasonable sanction from yourself if someone chooses to proactively not follow this. And if we're expecting to put sanctions in place, we need to put a right of appeal in place as well. It seems like a bum piece of legislation. I'm not going to object to you signing the minutes. I'll support that. But what I wanted to tease out was that lack of right of appeal. It's not right in legislation.
Councillor Cope?
Thanks. I agree with Councillor Lee that the legislation's a bit rubbish, but based on my experiences of making one of these, firstly it goes to sort of officers investigate. They then find whether their opinion is that there's been a breach of the Code of Conduct. And it's only once that first stage has been gone through that we would get to this second stage. So I guess in some ways, as Councillor Benton said, this is an appeal. But am I right that it would always follow that two-stage process? I.e., we would never get to this stage unless the officer investigation found that there had been a breach, or they thought there had been a breach.
Yes, that's right. So when the initial complaint comes in, there's a sifting process that the monitoring officer will go through. They'll liaise with the independent person, so, a fresh pair of eyes, whether they consider that the matter should be investigated. The person that's been complained about has an opportunity to see the complaint and their response is taken into account. And that after, reviewing both sides and the independent person's opinion, only at that point would it be referred on to a subcommittee for a hearing.
And as we know, it doesn't appear to work.
One final question. I may partly misunderstand this, but I'm sure I've heard about this a little while ago, this particular debate. I'm sure it was discussed when I was at Windlesham Parish Council. I could be wrong. And there was talk of a recording of the hearing as well. I was trying to find that mentioned in the minutes. Did I miss that?
There was no recording of the meeting made while we were in here that I know of.
Perhaps I misunderstood what they were saying, but they claimed they had a recording of a meeting. Perhaps I misunderstood that then.
No.
Unless it was a covert recording.
Probably.
I'm aware of the matter. The parish councillor who the complaint was the subject of the complaint did ask at the start of the meeting whether he could record the meeting, obviously not the subcommittee's confidential deliberations, but he did ask whether he could record part of the subcommittee meeting, and that was granted.
I've signed them anyway. And I think that concludes
The work programme?
the work programme, concludes the meeting. So, work programme. No?
Okay.
Any comments about the work programme? Alex?
I think the clerk of the committee is already aware of this, but members should note that for the July meeting, there won't be 2 outstanding audit recommendation reports. They're not good enough to have 2 of them, so there will just be the one. So members shouldn't panic that there'll be 2 of those. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Alex. Members, officers, this is probably my last meeting as chair. I know, tearful. I've sat here for most of one council and half of another, far too long, and I might do something else. So, anybody who wants to take the chair. Oh, an opposition member who wants to take the chair.
I'm happy to defect and take the chair for giggles.
Anyone but no. Just think about it, because I might be a member of the committee, but I'm not going to be chair.
I think one observation is I'll throw my hat in the ring if you don't, Johnny.
For God's sake!
I was about to accept your defection, Councillor.
I don't think it was going to be to you.
We could become One Nation independence.
Councillor MacDonald, don't shout.
Yeah, just sorry, I haven't been shouting, but so obviously something going wrong today. Perhaps one or other of the members of the committee might like to just propose a vote of thanks to the chair for his work, but also just note that I think he hasn't actually signed off any audited accounts, which was one of his missions in life, but we won't hold that against him.
One almost audited.
Have to be quiet for a minute. We need to propose a vote of thanks. Do you want to propose it, or shall I do it, Johnny?
I'm happy to propose a vote of thanks to Councillor Betton for his work over the past, 6 years, is it? 6 years plus chairing this committee.
And I'm very happy to second Councillor Cope's motion.
Thank you very much. You're all very kind. And it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. And that closes the meeting. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.